Hey everyone. Today I want to start digging into the WBC score sheet as it currently stands for the 2024 competition season. Now, if you're not familiar with the World Barista Championship, I'll have links down in the notes below. Go ahead and check those out. But this is really for all of you who know what I'm talking about, hopefully. So buckle up, this one is going to have a lot in it. So as always, we're going to look at the rules and regulations first and see what is it saying about what the judges are looking for in an espresso. Now, if you look at the actual sensory score sheet first and foremost, you will see 5 different scoring categories. We have crema, we have accuracy of taste descriptors, accuracy of tactile descriptors, taste experience, and tactile experience. There is a lot to dig into on this. Looking at the rules and regulations, I'm just going to read through these kind of briefly. Once again, I always recommend read through the rules and regulations every year, in fact, because there are changes and adjustments to the wording, and that can make a big difference in terms of what the judges may be looking for and how the rules are applied. So to get into it, we're looking at page 33 through 35, section 15.1, the espresso evaluation. Now, the espressos are evaluated by protocol. The judges have the same steps, and I'll probably make a different video going through the judge's experience of what it is like to judge an espresso on stage at a different time. So I'll talk about the protocols and all those types of things a little bit later. But let's really look at the things that apply to the score boxes right now. The first one being crema, right? Judges will evaluate the crema, appearance of the crema in the vessel, right? It's scored a yes or a no, it's 1 or 0 points. There is either crema that is covering the entirety of the top of the cup, or there is a hole in it, or you can see through it. Those are sort of the 3 things that happen with crema. The crema must stretch across the entire surface of the espresso and not have any holes or broken spots. So technically speaking, if you can see through the crema, but it is still intact, there's not a visible hole in it, that is a 1. That is a yes. You did have crema on the coffee, right? Now, I find the crema score to be a little bit of a holdover from the way we used to judge espresso. We used to actually have to tip the cup and look through it and do all these different things to look at the persistence of the crema, a number of other things. They're really based off of old traditional expectations of coffee. And so by making it just is there crema, yes or no, has sort of opened that up to a lot more applications of making coffee. A lot of the style that we make coffee nowadays doesn't have super thick crema. But in general, identifying is the crema there is a little antiquated, but it does still add texture to the drinking experience. So there probably is some benefit to it. I think that is still one of the things that people look for. If you go and ask a random person what makes a great espresso, they'll say it has crema. So there's probably still some relevance to the crema score, I suppose, in there, although it's only worth 1 point, right? It's not really a big thing. But let's move on to the accuracy of the taste descriptors. Now, there's a lot to talk about in here, and I'm going to go through each of these in terms of how they're scored in a minute. So I just want to briefly touch on what each of these things is. Accuracy of taste descriptors is you're on stage, you describe what the taste, the flavor, and the aftertaste of the coffee is after I've swallowed the coffee. You tell me what it is, I write it down, and then I taste the coffee, and judges will generally do one of 2 things. They will either tick, they'll say they tick, yes, I taste that, I kind of taste that, I don't taste that, next to what you've written, what you've told them, and they've written down. They may also note down things that they taste in the espresso, right? So you said it tastes like oranges and Tootsie Rolls and carob, right? And I taste yellow stone fruit, and I taste milk chocolate and some sort of candy-like sweetness, right? So I'm going to say, okay, well, I taste something a little bit different, but let's interpret those. And generally speaking, it's was what you said relatively accurate to what I experienced in the cup? If I tasted completely different things, and I wrote down completely different things, your score is probably going to be a lot more negative. Overall, the taste profile of the beverage served should support specialty coffee. There's a wording in here, and my understanding of support specialty coffee is that these need to be positive, high-quality flavor notes, such as the flavors that we find on the SCA flavor wheel, or anything that is, you know, considered to be a positive experience. And this can get a little bit ambiguous, but so if you say it tastes like, you know, dry white wine, maybe that should mean a good thing, but for some people that's a bad experience for some reason. So this one, that particular wording is a little bit difficult to navigate sometimes, but generally speaking, if you say, hey, we're talking about fruits, we're talking about sweet things, chocolates, florals, there could be spices, there could be nuts, there could be other things that are a positive nature. Now, if you say something that insinuates mold or a defect, or you say something that insinuates a poor roast, you know, if you say smoke or something along those lines in the espresso flavor, that's probably not a specialty supporting flavor, right? So the score is really purely how accurate it is. Now, they've changed the scoring of this category as well to be 0 to 3 instead of 0 to 6, and 0 to 3 being 0, 1, 2, or 3 with no half points. And that just means it is, you didn't give any flavor notes, you get a 0. You gave flavor notes in general, that's a 1. If you gave flavor notes and they weren't terribly accurate, some were accurate, some were not, that's a 2. And if it was highly accurate, everything lines up, right, in the interpretation, then that's a 3. So moving on, the accuracy of tactile descriptors is very similar. It's looking at the thickness and the texture of the coffee. If you describe the thickness and the texture accurately, so I say, hey, it's a medium weight, or it's thick like this tactile thing that I'm giving you, or it's textural like this thing that I've given you, or it's, you know, it's creamy or velvety or any of these other descriptions we use, then and it is in fact that way, then that is an accurate description. So taste experience. Now here's where we get into some really big meaty bits of this score sheet, right? Taste experience is, it really, there's like 4 paragraphs in here of what it is. Flavor is defined as the combined perception of basic taste: sour, sweet, salty, bitter, umami, right? As well as aromatic qualities, right? And aftertaste is defined as a combination sensation of basic tastes and aromatic qualities that remain after coffee has left the mouth, either by swallowing or spitting it out. And a really interesting thing of note is that this rule states both the taste components of the extraction of how you made the coffee, as well as the coffee itself are evaluated, meaning that if you channeled a shot and it tastes unevenly extracted, or it tastes sour and bitter and dry and astringent and different things like that, that is taken into that flavor balance as well. So it's not just purely, hey, I bought a really amazing coffee and I roasted it really well. You do also have to extract it really well. If one or more of the taste components detracts from the flavor experience of the espresso, sour or acrid, and the aftertaste of the espresso, or as in bitter or something like that, lower marks. Some interesting wordings in here, right? So if the espresso is unbalanced, meaning that it's lacking something, or it has a taste component that is overpowering, then that score is reduced, right? So what this makes me think about is like infused coffees or co-fermented coffees, things like that, that, you know, may have a really, really intense presence of a specific fruit. That could be judged down because of the nature of this one characteristic being overpowering. Now, what I'd like to say, and I don't believe this is the way it's currently interpreted, but I would like that to really encompass finding the balance of the coffee's characteristic, right? A really well-made coffee, in my opinion. Now, I've talked to a few other professionals about this, and they feel the same way, but a really excellent coffee should have the flavor characteristics of the origin and the varietal, those types of things. Some level of the processing. Now, when it's washed, you don't really taste a whole lot, right? But there is some level of what that impact is having on the coffee, and the roasting of the coffee as well as the extraction. So you should be able to taste sort of elements of all of those things together, and that to me defines a really excellent coffee. But I don't think that the rules are really quite saying that, but it could be interpreted that way if somebody kind of went that direction. Lastly, move on to the tactile experience. The tactile experience is really defined by the thickness and the texture of the espresso served. It correlates the preparation, the method of extraction, the coffee used, right? So there's a lot of different things that can tie into the extraction of the coffee. So if you say, I'm doing a really long extraction, I'm doing 17 grams in, I'm doing 95 grams out, or whatever it is, I think that's probably going a little far. But if you say that, and it is, so the result is going to be sort of a medium light to light, thickness of the coffee, but the texture is going to be amazing. And that's what it delivers. That is acceptable, right? Like there's sort of a line that gets measured, which is sort of like, did it become watery, right? Like it's like to the point of being unpleasantly thin. Like I say, it's a little hard to define. But if you have said, hey, I'm doing this for a very specific purpose, this is the way that I like to make my coffee, and I think it tastes the best this way, then that is okay, as long as it doesn't get to the point where it's just like, this doesn't even, there's no textural elements to it. There's none of the other things coming into it, or it just feels like water in your mouth. That could potentially get some lowered scores to it. I say both a light and a heavy weight can receive high scores relative to the texture quality of the mouth. And in my opinion, it really is about the texture, right? The weight to me is inconsequential as long as it's not overly watery or insanely thick, but that's going to affect the flavor balance, right? So really the texture has much more to do with the overall scoring of this category. Now we used to also say the finish, right? And the finish is not really stated to be an expectation in the tactile description, although I'm sure you can include it, people still do. But the finish is specifically stated that after the coffee has left your mouth, the tactile experience afterwards can be taken into consideration for the finish in this category as well. So if it's astringent, lingering, or something like that, then that's a negative. I would say that more than anything, really what we're trying to say is don't have it be dry and astringent. Just make sure it's clean or smooth or something that is positive in the finish, right? But that's basically the four tasting categories of the rules and regulations. I highly recommend, like I say, dig into these, really look at them. There's a lot of stuff to really process in here. But also pages 9 through 10 in the rules and regulations, section 3.1, has sort of a definition of exactly what an espresso is for the competition's purposes. Those are always really important to look at. But let's talk about a couple of different specifics in this, okay? So starting off, let's talk accuracy of taste descriptors, right? Now, I started off by talking about this as being a 0 to 3 scoring category. Now, that means that there's 1 point for each of these variations in how accurate it is. And the idea behind this is to say, don't overthink it, right? It either was accurate, it was sort of accurate, or it wasn't accurate, right? That's basically what it is. And in reality, if you just say any flavor notes, that is a 1, right? So you're determining between did anything you say line up with what the coffee is? Did some of what you said lines up with the coffee is, or did pretty much everything of what you said line up with what the coffee is? I want to point this out in the terms of flavor note scrutinizing, as I would call it, right? There's a general sense of a flavor versus hyper accuracy. We've been going down a road of hyper accuracy in the past, and I have not liked that, because in my opinion, and I believe that there's some truth that it's based on, everybody has a different flavor memory. The rules have been adjusted with the intention that if you are saying something in the accurate category of the flavor, then that is correct, right? So once again, like if you say orange, right? And I say like, well, it tastes like a mandarin. It kind of tastes like that part of a mandarin that you get when you take the peel off, the white pithy part on the outside. And it's like, well, okay, that sounds like an orange to me, right? Now there's a little bit of debate you could have on the flavor balance in terms of the pithiness and is that positive or negative. But you described an orange and I tasted some form of sweet citrus like an orange, then that seems pretty accurate to me. So I don't feel like there's the need to say this, to scrutinize between, this tasted like a ruby red grapefruit as opposed to a yellow grapefruit. It's like, well, maybe I haven't tasted a ruby red grapefruit, but I know what a grapefruit tastes like, right? I still feel like you're being accurate there. So the idea here is not to overthink it, but to give a snapshot and say, yeah, you're in the right range there. That's pretty accurate, and it's a good style of a specialty, supporting specialty type of flavor, right? So really, it does play into that supporting specialty. If I'm nitpicking the pithy bit of a mandarin orange, then I'm still in the specialty range. It may be more of an extraction element that I'm really trying to dig into. Now, one of the things that I want to dig into with this 0 to 3 scoring on the taste description and the tactile description, they're basically 0 to 3, right? Super straightforward, but they all have multipliers, right? So the crema doesn't have a multiplier. Super easy. 1 or 0, that's it. Times 4 judges, there you go, right? The taste in particular is the most heavily penalized scoring box on the score sheet that I've seen, because while it's 0 to 3, the taste description is times 4 points, right? And so this is why it's important for the competitors to be accurate with what they're saying, but it's also important for the judges to be calibrated and fair with what they're scoring, because 1 point difference times 4 judges is 16 points different for that competitor. And that can be the difference between making the semifinals or making the finals, when it's really that somebody's being pedantic in their interpretation of it, or that you were careless in your explanation of what the coffee was. So it's really important to focus on the taste in particular. That's 16 points. Now, just briefly, when it gets to the tactile, it's only times 2 as a times 2 multiplier. So it's only 8 points. Still a lot of points, but it's not nearly as much. It's half as many points that you lose for that 1 point difference. But these 0 to 3 scores, while they seem straightforward, they need to be calibrated properly and they need to be explained properly, because they have massive impacts on your overall score. Okay? So let's talk about the tactile descriptors in the same way, right? Same 0 to 3 scoring. Really, we're looking at texture and thickness of the coffee, which is what we used to call weight, right? Heavy, full, thin, light, whatever you want to call that weight, right? The texture is, like I say, the really valuable bit. This is the one that is the mouth feel, the feeling of the espresso washing over your tongue, in your mouth, as it moves through your palate. Now, there is something really interesting in the tactile descriptors that I want to call out, which is that it says if the experience matches the description, so you were accurate in your description, but the tactile experience score is low, so your other score, your 0 to 6, is low, then high marks can't be given in the tactile description section. And so to me, this is double rewarding, or it's double penalizing if you're right or wrong. And so to me, there's something wrong with this, and I feel like that's a different discussion, right? So we're going to talk, this is what the rules say right now. But it is really important that you have a high quality texture and tactile, because it affects both scores, right? I think in the future revisions of the scoring, I think that needs to be addressed and adjusted, but it's something you need to know, because the texture has an enormous amount of weight on your final score, and because of that double scoring, essentially. So let's move on to the taste experience. What is a balanced espresso? This is a little bit of a point of contention, but I've taught people a lot about this. In what we're looking at is the quality aspects, right? The quality of the coffee, the quality of the extraction, to a degree, the quality of the roasting as well. In particular, we call it flavor and aftertaste. If you look at acid, sweetness, and bitterness, and now salt and umami as a harmony, right? Salt and umami have been included recently in the rules, because we mostly would just say acidity, sweetness, and bitterness. There is the potential to have salt, and there is salt in coffee. And umami is something that's coming out a lot, especially in heavily fermented coffees. So those need to become harmonious, right? Now, if you just look at it, and the easiest way to explain it is if you just look at acid, sweet, and bitter, right? Sweetness balances everything, right? And we see this in the signature drink and other things. You add a simple syrup or you add some sweet element because it balances everything else out, right? You've added some acid, you've added whatever else. Now, in my perspective, you can have a fairly acidic coffee that is balanced by having more sweetness. You may not have a lot of bitterness in that to balance it, but the sweetness helps balance that acid, and that can be a high quality. You can also have a relatively bitter coffee, say it's through the roast or something else, but having a supporting sweetness can help to balance that. So you can actually have a balanced espresso that is a little bit bitter, right? And now in its ultimate form, I feel like you have sort of moderating levels of acid depending on the coffee. You've got some level of bitterness, usually a little bit lower. So it's just sort of a supporting bitterness that's giving some complexity, giving some different things to the coffee. But you've got a really big backbone, a big structural element of sweetness, and that is what is starting to make harmony. It's starting to what's making balance in all those componentry, right? Now the other element of harmony, when we talk about that with espresso, is do they interconnect, right? Do they seem like they're all doing something together to make the drink? Sometimes you get this thing where it's like there's this massive acid, and there is a pretty good amount of sweetness, but they seem almost like separated from each other. And this is a wording. A lot of people, you will use this in their scoring as a judge, and they'll say it was a bit disjointed, right? I don't like this wording. I think it's a cop-out half the time. It doesn't mean anything half the time. But the idea being, on a fundamental level, if you were to say disjointed flavors, would sort of be saying that, you know, the bitterness and the acid and the sweetness didn't really connect and build something harmonious together. A little nebulous, but it is the nature of the rules, right? So you want to make sure that something is just all working together. Not too much acid, not too much bitterness. I don't know if you can have too much sweetness, although actually now that I think about it, I used to say you can't have too much sweetness, but you can if it's the wrong type of sweetness, right? There are certain coffee varieties in particular, or species, that have this massive amount of some sweet thing that seems like stevia, to me tastes like artificial sugar, and that actually overpowers the acids and the other elements of the coffee. And I feel like those are not harmonious coffees because that sweetness just overpowers everything else. So it is important to look at everything in perspective there. I do want to go back to what I said a little bit ago, which was that if there's something lacking in characteristic or overpowering, it may reduce the score. And that's really important to remember, because those very, like, we used to be just chasing distinction of flavor notes as the most important thing. If you nailed that, even if your balance wasn't perfect, you'd still do pretty darn well, right? Now you may very well get pinged and make, you know, your score reduced because of some of those incredibly overpowering flavor components or characteristics. Also, if there's something lacking, like say there's no acidity, or there is, you know, something that's just a little bit hollow, right? It feels like there's something missing in the middle of the coffee. That could be considered a negative for your flavor experience. Now, something that I want to point out, I didn't mention before, but with the flavor and the tactile, like the experience scores, the 0 to 6s, the description that you give for the accurate description of flavor and tactile and everything does not affect my scoring of this, right? So when I'm tasting your espresso and I'm tasting for the flavor experience, the taste experience, your description of it, so you say, oh, it's got a medium high sweetness and it's got a medium acid and whatever else, like, I don't care, right? That has no impact on my scoring of this element at all. It's interesting if you're accurate with it. Maybe it helps your accuracy score, or it gives an impression of your professionalism perhaps, but ultimately a balanced espresso is a balanced espresso. A harmonious espresso is a harmonious espresso. So your description has no weight on how I score the balance of the espresso or the tactile experience. right? So keep that in mind. If you're looking for more words to add, I don't find those to be terribly useful words. They not necessarily they're bad to say, but there may be more important things to say about your coffee as well. So the last thing that I want to get to is the tactile experience, right? So in particular, what is a high quality tactile experience, right? So we're looking at thickness and texture, possibly the aftertaste sensations as well, right? And now I want to assume, I always say, like, if it is clean or smooth or otherwise pleasant sensation, maybe lingering in some way, in the finish, then that is good. And I don't even need to really think about it much more than that, because there wasn't anything negative that stuck with me, right? If there is something that's lingering, such as a note of toffee or chocolate or something like that, that is considered in the flavor experience, not in the tactile experience, right? So just delineating this, if there's a taste that I taste, or if you described that flavor lingering, that is going to go into the accuracy of flavor description category as well, right? So differentiation, make sure that you know where everything is fitting as well. There's no expectation for a specific weight or texture, but there is sort of a point of it being too thin, like I said before, right? But as long as you can justify it through your extraction, it is pleasing on the mouth. It is a high quality experience, whereas all of a sudden everything is just like, ooh, that's really pleasant. That is enticing. Makes me want to drink more. If I want to drink more of my espresso, as a judge on stage, I can't unless you've told me to, but if I want to drink more of the espresso, that is just a good thing, right? That's going to be high scores. Now, the last thing that I want to talk to you about in the espresso scoring category of the score sheet is the sort of the weighting, right? So we already talked about, what's 1 point difference matter in the flavor description and the tactile description. But let's talk a little bit about just generally the categories and what they account for, right? So the espresso category accounts for roughly 30%, 29.5% of the overall sensory score sheet. Now this will have a little bit of a change if you have technical judges in the first round of the World Barista Championship, then your overall weighting of the espresso category will be something like 24%, right? But generally it's almost 30%, it's almost a third of the overall score is the espresso category. And this is good because it's sort of giving, it's I think the highest scored category of the sheet in terms of those three categories, espresso, milk, and signature drink. But it's not blowing out of the water anything else necessarily anymore because we've changed that. I think that the taste accuracy score is the one thing that should be changed in the future. I think it shouldn't be worth so many points, but it is right now, and that is the important thing to remember. Remember, the espresso accounts for a large amount of your overall score. From a raw weight category, the taste experience is the highest percentage of the flavor category, right? But, as I mentioned before, the differences in score, the deviation of 1 point difference or half point difference, depending on where you're at, is the most pronounced in the flavor accuracy. So if you're going to make sure that you nail something in that way and you don't get the lower score, flavor accuracy is the one to do. If you also are looking at what is the most important thing that I maximize my score on as high as it can possibly go, it's taste experience. That's worth 18 points after the multiplier per judge, right? So that's by far the most weight in this category, right? After that, flavor accuracy and tactile experience are both weighted the same in terms of the raw percentage of the overall score. The tactile accuracy is actually only worth 6 points. It's actually the least valuable one on the score sheet of the espresso category. So just some understanding of where everything's at, how it all sits. There's the weighting percentage, but then there's also the deviations. It's really important to understand those. So that's it. That's the rundown of the espresso category on the World Barista Championship score sheet. Since the espresso is sort of the base, the foundation of all of the drinks that you make, even if you're using a different coffee, it demonstrates your skill at making coffee. I do find it to be, the most important category to really perfect first. If you're going to focus on one thing, know and make sure you can just make coffee excellently every single time, right? Anyway, that's all I have for today. I know this video is probably a lot longer than previous ones, but there's been so much to talk about in here. I hope that it's been useful. I hope it's been interesting. Please follow and subscribe and share this video. I'm going to continue next. The next category is obviously going to be the milk drink category. And there's probably a little bit less detail that I have to go into on here, but there are some rule changes and some things that have changed in the last couple of years in this. So I do want to call those out. Stay tuned next time. Thanks for joining.